Well, good morning, everyone. Many times over the years, people have asked me that how did you, as a blind guy, a blind individual, get started in the coffee business? And especially from my background was in the horse business. And I won't go into that, but made my living with horses for over 30 years. And it was kind of a fun little journey. We lived on the eastern side of the Sierras, Bishop, California, down in Death Valley. I worked up in the Gardnerville area for a while in the 80s. And traveling through that area, past Mammoth Lakes, there was a family out of Bishop, the Kennedys, had a bunch of boys. And one of them, Brent Kennedy, had a coffee house, it's still there, in Mammoth Lakes, called the Looney Bean. And they made the best coffee, espressos and mochas and all the good stuff. And I would stop hauling horses up and down the highway, and I'd swing in there, and they had this little shack next to that's what it seemed like, a little shack next to the Chevron station there, and fill up and then go over and get a Looney Bean coffee. And I'd talk to Brent, and of course I was kind of a cowboy guy, and he's kind of a coffee hippie dude, and I'd always kind of go, man, I want to get in the coffee business. And he'd always say, hey, anytime, let me know, and it was more just tongue in cheek. But so when I started going blind in 2006, and it was side effects of when I had cancer as a kid, childhood eye cancer. It was the side effects of the radiation treatments 50 years later that took my eyesight out. But when I started going blind, what really scared me was, what does a blind guy do? How do you make a living? How do you function, first of all, but how do you make a living? Because I was always kind of a workaholic and liked to work. I enjoy working. And which was kind of ironic, the only blind guy I'd ever seen actually working, not that I was paying a lot of attention, I guess, but was a young man at the University of Nevada, Reno bookstore. Now that's kind of ironic, a blind guy working at the bookstore. And I think he was visually impaired. And I can say these things because I'm a blind guy. To me, there's a difference between visually impaired, where you can see something, and when you're a blind. I'm 100% blind. I would give your left arm to see shadows would be awesome, but I see nothing. And so I got to thinking about the coffee business. I love coffee, and did a little research and realized how massive the coffee business was. And I thought, well, man, if I can just get a little sliver of this business, I can make myself a living. And so I went back down to Brent Kennedy, and I said, hey, you think a blind guy could do this? And he's kind of got a funny sense of humor, and I can always remember, he kind of paused for a minute, and he goes, well, pouring coffee might be a little difficult for the customers, but yeah, you could do this. And so I do everything full bore, jump up here. I don't test the waters very well. I just jump in. And so I started my in search to see if I could get in the coffee business. And at first we were gonna have a coffee house, and the boom was on, and the Reno area, we were living up in north of Reno at this time, in Palomino Valley, and every developer that was putting in anything, if your coffee company didn't start with an S, and I'll let you figure that one out, they didn't want you in their new development. So we could not find a place to put an actual coffee house in. And I wanted to roast. I wanted an in-house roaster. So SCAA, the Specialty Coffee Association, had their big annual event that year down in, must have been in 2007, because I could still see just shadows. I had my cane, I couldn't drive anymore, and Robin was taking me everywhere. So we went down to the SCA in San Diego, and started walking all the booths, seeing which coffee roaster manufacturer might be able to help me. Well, most of them blew me off. You know, they just like, yeah, really, you're a blind guy, you're blah, blah, blah. And towards the end of my search, of course, not being able to see, I couldn't see who was who in the zoo down there. I ended up at this big giant booth at the end of one of the hallways, and it was Dietrich. And I went to the salesman, met me, and to be honest with you, he was kind of the same with everybody else. You could tell he was like, yeah, really. And before I left, this man walked up next to me and put his arm on my shoulder and said, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I'm going blind and I want to learn to roast coffee. And he's like, really? And I go, yeah. And he goes, I'll help you. I'll do what it takes. And it was Steve Dietrich himself. And he invited me up to Ponderay, Idaho to take some classes. And that's how I got started in the coffee business. I could still see, and I can remember my daughter and I, Samantha, out in north of Reno, Nevada, we built this little tiny shack, and I mean little shack, just big enough to put the roaster. And I bought a small roaster, just a 15-pounder, and I bought a small roaster and an afterburner, and we put it in this little tiny shack that would fit this roaster. And it was wintertime and it was cold, and I could barely see. And Dietrich had built this big, large screen that I could get real close to, and with my magnifying glass, and I could read all the different icons on there. And that's how I started roasting. I had this giant flip board, you know, these pages that were 3 foot by 2 foot wide. And in big letters, I was writing out my profiles as I was trying to learn to roast. And I was calling Steve Dietrich and hitting Brent up and anybody else who might share some profiles, some blends, anything that I could play with. At that point in time, I also, which this was a huge, it's amazing how things align up. I called Royal Coffee, and I had been turned on to a couple of brokers there that these other roasters thought could help me out. Well, when I called Royal, these other brokers were booked. They didn't have any more room for anybody else. But they said, hey, there's a new guy coming on. And I thought, a new guy? You know, I'm a new guy. The last thing I need is a new broker. And they said, no, we think you'll do pretty good for you. So I called back the next day to talk to this new broker who happened to be named Max. And we built a relationship. And after a while, I realized, or was informed later on, that Max just happened to be the owner or son of Royal Coffee, which was pretty cool because he kind of started his brokerage side. Obviously, he'd been in the coffee business his whole life, so he was very well versed in it already. And here I'm starting new as a blind guy and roasting, and it became a great relationship. I cannot tell you how the brokers at Royal Coffee just immensely helped us. They went out of their way for me, and it was so cool to have that help. So in essence, how I got into the coffee business as a blind person is I was helped by a lot of people, from Brent Kennedy to Steve Dietrich to Max at Royal Coffee and many others behind there. And that made my journey possible. Meanwhile, the coffee house business was not working out. I mean, we could not find a spot to put a coffee house in there. And so and again, most people were not taking me serious as a blind person. And you know, you go to you go to a developer who's putting in a multi-million-dollar facility, and here this blind guy is telling him, you want to put your shop in there, and he's like, yeah, right. And we were starting to sell a little bit of wholesale, and one day I was frustrated. We're driving through town, Robin and I. I'm pretty blind at this point in time. I can't hardly see anything. And we'd gone out trying to sell some coffee, and we weren't very successful, mainly because we were so new at it. We had great coffees already, which again, we've been so blessed by the help we'd had. Our espresso blend, our dark blend, our medium blend, and a couple of single origins, they were just excellent coffees. And so we had good quality coffee, we just didn't have a name out there yet. And so anyways, one day we're driving down the road in Reno. Actually, I think it was the Sparks, Nevada. They're basically hooked together. And I looked at, I always like saying that, blind guy, I looked over there. I looked at Robin and I said, hey, just pull into the next grocery store. I said, I don't care what it is, just pull in. So she pulled in, I didn't know who it was. We pulled in there, I grabbed some bags of coffee, she led me in there, and I said, just take me up to the cashier. So anyways, we walk into this grocery store and I got an armful of bags of coffee, you know, and I got my cane and got Robin leading me by the ear probably, you know. And I go up to the cashier and she's busy, and I go, excuse me, you know, excuse me, and you know, what can I, and I just hold up a bag. How do I get my coffee into this store? And she's like, what? I go, how do I get my coffee in here? And she goes, really? I go, yeah. She says, hang on, let me call the manager. So we wait for a few minutes. Pretty soon the manager, was a gal, and she comes out, can I help you? And I did the same. I just held her. Says, how do I get my coffee on the shelf here? And she goes, what? This is kind of the same man. It's like, what? I go, no, really. I says, how do I get my coffee? And she's, it's almost like, are you kidding? And I go, no, I want to know. And so, you know, it was like a head scratcher. And so she says, well, I will give you the buyer's name. And let me run up, I'll give you his name and his phone number, and good luck. So again, I start telling this story and I think of all the parts that how we were so blessed where we went and how this all panned out. But so she comes back down and she goes, here's his name, it's Kevin Clark. And this happened to be at Scolari's and grocery stores. Here's his number, give him a call, good luck. So I went home, immediately called him on the phone. Took me a couple of calls, finally got an appointment. So one day, you know, Sam and I are all, now it's Samantha, my daughter, we're all excited. We go down to Scolari's, their office, corporate office is there in town. And we're excited, but nervous, really nervous. So we walk into this guy who we don't know anything. Walk into this guy's office, carrying my cane. I think I might have even brought my dog, because that always kind of helps. Everybody seems to like dogs, and if they don't like me, they'll like my dog, and so that kind of helps, you know. So anyways, we go in there. Well, to make a long story short, he accepts us into the grocery store. And that started our journey into the grocery store business. And that really put us into the wholesale business. Next thing you knew, we had Rayleigh's, we had Whole Foods. I worked for years, and I mean years, I believe 4.5 years, in getting into Costco's. We ended up into Safeways. And today, I'll be honest with you, as I sit here in April 20th of 2024, which I believe is our 17th year in business, I don't know all the grocery store chains that we're now into, mainly because I've been fairly retired for the last 4.5 years. But I know we've expanded into quite a few different chains. one of the interesting things back with Kevin Clark was after we built a relationship and we started doing well in his stores, he said, well, the truth is, Mark, as soon as you walked in the door and I saw that you were blind, you were in. I thought, he says, but I just had to make you jump through some hoops. And he did. He put me through the ringer several times. Like Sam and I about cried, thinking we're never gonna make this. We're never gonna make this. But sure enough, he like I said, he says, once you walked in that door blind and you're trying to do this, you were in the door. And so that's really how we got in, how we, and it wasn't just me, and my family, my kids, my wife, we worked really hard to make this company go. I'm a workaholic. I was working 7 days a week, many hours every day, trying to learn the trade, trying to learn the skill of roasting. I found a device that hooked up to, I used that small 15-pounder for several years, and then it was just too small. The production was outdoing that little roaster. It was running 24/7, and went up to a 15-pounder. Now we're at a 75-pounder, I guess is what the new ones are. But I found a device that I could hook into my roaster that would tie in to the tell the time for me, and it would tell temperature every 4 seconds. I could actually go from 4 seconds to 15 seconds. And so I would put that on, turn that on, start my roast, and that would keep me in track with my time and my temperature. And then as we developed what we called the SRT, sensory roasting techniques, smell and sound ties in with those two factors of time and temperature. And that's how we developed our roast profiles. I also, which is interesting, is I learned how to maintain the roasters. I like to do a lot of things and put my hands on there. And it's interesting with my blindness, since I could see for 50 years, when I touch something, subconsciously, my mind makes a picture. I don't even realize it anymore. My mind makes a picture of it in what it is. And so as I was handling the roaster and got more and more familiar with it, I could tear that thing apart. I could clean it. I could service it. I did 95+% of the work on the roaster itself. I do have a funny story though. We were roasting one day, and I had ran that roaster. This was the 25-pounder. I had ran that thing so many hours in those years we had it that the screen on the back of the drum had created a hole in it, and I didn't know about this hole. And beans and chaff would dribble out the backside of that hole. And so one day I was cleaning the roaster, and Jen, our production manager, she was on the other side. She says, "Hey, Mark, I think you got a little bit of a fire going over there. You got some smoke coming out." And there was a spot that I had a little bit of trouble with before, and of course I had everything I needed to control any kind of a fire. And so I shut the roaster down, and I took care of it. And sure enough, there was a little bit of chaff collected in this one spot that was smoldering. So I took care of all of that, and I thought, well, I'm gonna let it cool down, and I'm gonna go ahead and clean my roaster. So I'm cleaning the roaster. It's cooled way down. I put my hand everywhere, and everything's fine, and they're doing production over there, and so I open it up and I start vacuuming out, and I vacuum out underneath the drum, And I'm just happy as a clam going, and all of a sudden Jen and them start yelling, "You're on fire, you're on fire." Well, that shop vac in the back where that the drum where it had been dribbling out behind the screen there, that's what was smoldering. And of course I could never feel it to see where the heat was coming from. I thought it was all cooled down. That shop vac sucked those little embers up, and of course the air and that vacuum, man, it caught on fire inside that shop vac so fast. and then out the exhaust of the shop vac was shooting flames out the back onto a pallet of burlap coffee bags. They caught on fire. So fortunately, we rolled up the big door. We just wheeled the shop vac. Jennifer did. She just grabbed the shop vac and took it out in the alleyway and let it burn. And we used I had a bunch of spray water set up. And of course, we put the rest of the fire out. So there are some hazards of being blind and doing something like this. But I was almost always roasted with somebody around, so that, when something like that. That was really the only time that anything of hazard happened, but look back now, it's pretty funny. That shot back on, I'm just happy as a clam, doing what I was doing. But overall, it's been good. We grew. We again, everything aligned up. We hit it just when that specialty coffee was really hitting in our area in 2007, 2008. There already was a couple of roasters here, but we did hit it just right, and so it's not like we've done there's anything special about us or anything magical, or it's just hard work, being at the right place at the right time. The blindness, in some areas, like I mentioned, people would blow me off and not give me the time of day. And then other times with, Steve Dietrich and Kevin Clark and Royal Coffee, and they saw the struggle it was going to be to do something like this where you couldn't see, which is a very visual thing when you think about it, roasting coffee as the beans develop in the roast. And so it was not just a negative, but it was also a positive.